In this journey of conversations about towards global social theory, if we just connect to the earlier fascinating critique and challenge for reconstitution that Gurminder presented, for example, the continued existence of colonial modern, we can also look at the very category of the global, whether the category of global itself is colonial global. It is in that sense in a way of interrogating the very terms of discourse, which is not just a linguistic shift, but it is part of a multidimensional challenge of theoretical and practical transformation. Therefore, the plea for cultivating different pathways of planetary conversation is a critique of the notion of the global as it is produced in colonial violence, through colonial violence. But that production is not just historical or genealogical. It continues to characterize and constitute the contemporary global as well. So therefore, we need to think about global social theory with and beyond the logic of the global and move towards different modes of theoretical and practical engagement, which is suggested in this pathway of planetary conversations. And it is in this sense to bring Asia here as a multiplex partner of dialogue. I would just begin by reading these two paragraphs from my essay. Asia is not a predefined fixity. Asia is a journey of co-realization and pluralization. Though this discourse of Asia as multiple plural goes contrary to an earlier discourse of Asian universalism, which was present 100 years ago, in which Japanese thinkers like Okakura and Tagore were in conversation. But at that time, with Japanese thinker Okakura, it became much more a narrow concept of Asian universalism, though Tagore brought a much wider notion of Asian universalism. Similarly, social theory is not unitary. It is a plural process of reflection on the dynamics of self, culture, and society. But much of social theory, as it rules in the academic corridors of Europe, Asia, and the world, is Eurocentric. But now there is an epochal need for realizing social theories as part of planetary conversations. While some may look at it in terms of rise of Asia and the decline of Euro-America, our challenge here is not to replace one ethnocentrism and exclusivism with another, but make social theory a field of mutual learning and dialogue of presuppositions. For example, the presupposition about centrality of power. Yesterday, Ryan, in your presentation, you concluded with the challenge to recognize the power of post-colonial thinking, which also presupposes the power of power. But as power is a very important presupposition in social theory from Max Weber to Michel Foucault, and it can be traced back to Aristotle, the notion of the polis. But in many other traditions, for example, in the Indic tradition, in Bhagavad Gita, there is a line called Shraddha Maya Ayang Purushaha Jo Jat Shraddha Sa Ebasa, which means this Purusha, this person, which is not just male, is animated by Shraddha, which refers to both respect and love, and a person is one depending upon the quality of one's Shraddha. Therefore, to think about self, culture, and society, our presupposition cannot just be that human beings and social formations are only formations of power, but they are also at the same time embodiment in different ways the dynamics of Shraddha. Therefore, to think of social theory, we need to invite other categories of thinking like Shraddha in an open, critical, and non-categorical way. Therefore, an open project of theorizing would be that if we are beginning with the presupposition of Shraddha, but at one time with beginning with the presupposition of power, but power soon becomes a telos and a teleology, of course an ideology. Similarly, why not begin with bring the presupposition of Shraddha, and then not to valorize Shraddha uncritically, but to look at the dynamics of relationship between power and Shraddha in particular, historical, societal and contextual formation. It is a dialectic between power and Shraddha, but where this dialectic is not just closed within the traditions of dialectics, Hegelian dialectics, of Marxian dialectics, but as Roy Bhaskar would say, it is an open dialectics at the heart of which lies the project of self-transformation. So the whole path of planetary conversation, cultivation for example, it brings the process of labor, which has been mentioned, but it also brings the process of love and learning. Learning is also has been referred to in our dialogue. To be engaged with the process of planting of seeds and generating seeds of thinking and practice from different traditions. So therefore, cultivating planetary conversation, as it involves love, labor and learning in the context, in the histories and geographies and contemporary realities of hatred, laziness and structural ignorance and valorized ignorance. So it is in this context we also have to rethink theory. Theory itself as not just an abstract process of theorizing, and in my paper I invite us to think about theorizing as also walking, as walking meditation and dancing meditation. To bring ASEAN conversations on some of these themes, for example, both self and society are important categories in social theory, but the way to think about self, for example, the notion of self as individual in modernist social theory, but in ASEAN societies, as John's work suggests, that in many ASEAN societies there is a notion of self as a field, and that field is a field where energy flows, the notion of energy, Qi from the Confucian or Chinese tradition, or the idea of dynamic energy from the tradition of Kashmiri Shaivism. Therefore, the notion of self as field, and in a more imaginative way, we can also bring the notion of self as circle and spirals. And that idea of self as field, where the field is not just socio-political. The openness to the idea of field in social theory from Pierre Bourdieu would help us to realize that fields are socio-political. But an engagement with the notion of field from many other traditions, for example, in Indian traditions, like the way the field has been conceptualized in Bhagavad Gita, where the field is not just socio-political, but socio-psychological and socio-spiritual. Therefore, to realize that self is a field, where the field is not only socio-political, but socio-psychological and socio-spiritual. It is in the same sense the idea of individual. Now, in many Buddhist traditions, and John also has referred to it in his work, referring to the work of Sulak Sivarakya, where he is saying that in Buddhism there is a notion of individual as trans-individual. Therefore, idea of trans-individual as individual, it challenges us to rethink the genealogy of the modern as it is premised on, for example, Louis Dumou's account of rise of modern individualism, and to think further. Another important gift from dialogue with ASEAN societies and cultures, again in a pluralistic way, would be that in all these societies, that both individual and society are not imprisoned within what Fred Dallmayr calls an enlightenment black box separated from nature and divine, but they are in creative relationship with them. Therefore, to understand both self and society as part of relationship with nature and divine, for example. Now, divine or transcendence is a very interesting category in modern social theory. There is reference to transcendence, but we need to explore the multiple manifestation of transcendence. Kant talks about it, as I mentioned, Habermas also is referring to that. But it is not just immanent transcendence of the known kind. Can we also talk about transcendental immanence? It is in this sense we can revisit the multiple streams in European thinking itself, because in Europe itself or in the Euro-American world, there are multiple streams of reconstituting relationship between self and society as they are in relationship with nature and divine. One can think of the Romantic tradition, the transcendental tradition, Thoreau and Emerson in the American world, and both Thoreau and Emerson have their own share of contribution to building of struggle for justice and civil disobedience in the modern world. And it is in this context Goethe's work on nature and metamorphosis of plants, and where the idea of self and society are not closed within a mechanical model of Newton. J.P.S. Oberoi, a very creative social theorist from India, whose work also requires deep engagement, he is challenging us to realize the limits of our binding or bondage in modern science and social science to a Newtonian model. But if we also learn, work and meditate with Goethe, Oberoi would say that we would then be with a fourfold logic, and it is not just the dualistic logic of either or. And he is saying that here we can bring Goethe, Gandhi and the Hermetic tradition of Europe together. So with this kind of challenge for dialogue, then I would like to bring the way to think about the societal in multiple ways, to think about the societal as not just within the primacy of the logic of the state-centered societal that constitutes the assumption of society in modernist sociology. But Dayakrishna, a deeply challenging philosopher from India, he talks about two predicaments. One is the predicament of thinking about society only through societal terms, and another is the predicament of thinking through society through Atman or soul. And he is saying that in Indian society, society has not been given the primary significance that it has been given in modern West or even the Judeo-Christian tradition or even the Confucian tradition. Therefore, to think about the societal neither through the primacy of the societal, in fact, movements in contemporary sociology like Alan Turing's critique of the category of the societal, his very provocative essay, Sociology After Sociology. So we can make very interesting dialogue between this critique of the category of the societal from contemporary sociology to look at the societal itself as not just sociocentric or state-centric, but how does the societal creates a space for realization of the Atman and or the self, and the challenge for the self-centered positions would be that how do they create the space for the creation of dignified societal or the collective. It is in this sense that we can look at multiple traditions from Asia and two traditions that I would like to invite us to think about as dynamic formations and not just frozen hierarchical manifestations as they were in the past. One is Confucianism and the other is Vedanta. Now in Confucianism there is a attention to the significance of social relationship, waves of relationship, but many times while talking about relationships they have forgotten the need to nurture self. Therefore, the dialogue between Buddhism and Confucianism that led to Neo-Confucianism was a way of attending simultaneously to self and society in transformational way. Similarly, in Vedanta, while in classical Vedanta there is reference to self on the one hand and the challenge of realizing oneness, but that dialogue with self or engagement with self many times has been a closed engagement with appropriate relationship with society and societal transformation. But what happened in India in the last 150 years, starting from Ramakrishna Paramahansa, Swami Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo, Gandhi and Tagore. And one can also invite here Pandita Ramabai and to really bring the transformational gender dimension, is that all of them, that they challenge the closed nature of self-engagement, and where the engagement with self needs to be part of multidimensional transformation of the societal, including the transformation of the category of the dominant tradition and colonial modern. So therefore, the simultaneous attention to self and the societal in the Neo-Confucian and in Neo-Vedanta challenges us to think about dialogue among different Asian traditions, which can have very interesting possibility for rethinking terms of contemporary social theory. But to Dayakrishna, I also want to bring another element that he does not talk about, the element of anatta or no self from Buddhist thinking. That anatta or no self challenges us to realize that both self and society has a dimension of emptiness and or no self or indeterminacy. And that is the point that is also suggested by many post-structural thinkers. Therefore, it is no wonder that many scholars also have tried to find resonance between the great Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna and Derrida. So the point is that if we bring no self as an ongoing process, then we can bring this sociocentric and the limitations of sociocentric, the limitations of Atman-centric, and the possibility of no self together with another Buddhist idea of codependent origination. Therefore, speaking about the challenge of transformation in my paper, I also argue that how Confucianism, as it has been imprisoned within the logic of hierarchy and monological, needs to be part of a journey of multidimensional transformation. So is Vedanta. And it is in that journey that the work of people who are working with the spirit of oneness, but a transformational oneness. Therefore, Ambedkar, for example, when Ambedkar embraced Buddhism, but the story of Ambedkar does not just begin in 1916 when he wrote his Critique of Caste and when his embrace of Buddhism from 1916 to 1956, this 40 years of journey. But Buddhism itself, historically and conceptually, has been in profound dialogue with the challenge of Vedanta. There is already a dialogue between Vedanta and Buddhism. So my point is that we need to be part of this multiple, transversal dialogues, and the notion of harmony, that is a theme in Asian societies, that harmony may not be a static harmony. It has to be dynamic and transformational harmony, as the notion of unity, the challenge of unity, is not just a reproduction of existing logic of unity as it is characterized by caste domination and gender domination, but it is a transformational realization of still the challenge of becoming part of a one with and beyond our struggles for emancipation. It is in this context then social theory and Asian dialogues would challenge us to move from what I would like to call a judgmental comparison to generous comparison of comparisons. For example, while thinking about Asia and Europe, we are already within a priori judgmental comparison, as in Louis Dumos's work, India is homo hierarchical and West is homo equalis. But when we are comparing Asia or Europe, we need to move beyond this judgmental comparison, as we know that there is profound entrenched inequality in modern West, starting from its origin to its contemporary manifestation, as inequality is one of the defining features of contemporary Euro-American society. Similarly, there is struggle against hierarchy and inequality in Indian traditions and all traditions as well. So therefore, to have that kind of a generous comparison, we need to move with a methodology of what Marilyn Strathern would call partial connections rather than an ethnocentric wholesale comparison of civilizations. With this then, once we come to post-colonial theorizing, and in my paper I refer to that how while post-colonial theorizing is kind of looked at as a source of salvation, and it is kind of, but in reality the post-colonial discourse is really limited within a lot of its own self-imposed constraints. For example, one of the challenge of the post-colonial discourse and engagement is that it has very little engagement with cross-cultural dialogue, including dialogue with the traditions and cultures in which people in the so-called post-colonial societies live. So Partha Chatterjee's work, for example, Partha Chatterjee's critique of the limits of modern normative theory, where he is saying that modern normative theory does not really take into account the experience of the rest of the world. But as a post-colonial political theorist, does Chatterjee himself engage with traditions of thinking about polity? For example, as suggested in the work of Rameshwar Roy in Beyond Ego's Domain, where the whole notion of polity is not just a struggle for political power, but to be engaged in different kinds of. So while summing up then, I do not have to elaborate these few points, but I would just hint at one is that it is in this context we need to engage ourselves with a different kind of hermeneutics and phenomenology, what I called as multi-topial hermeneutics, where we are simultaneously engaged with travel, truth and translation, where social theorizing is part of satyagraha. But that satyagraha is not just a valorized epistemological direct action that Boaventura de Sousa Santos talks about. Another challenge here is what can be called as multiple transversality, and I would conclude with that. What I mean by this is that all of us, that wherever we are, we already have a history and experience of universal, though that universal has been characterized as parochial. So how do we build with our terms of thinking and look at other societies in a dialogical way? For example, the category of Sattva, Raja and Tama, these three categories coming from the Indic tradition, truth, power and kind of imprisonment with darkness, how they can help us to have a critical vocabulary about social theory. So therefore, cultivating planetary conversation would be to be engaged with these love, labor and processes of learning. Thank you so much.
Okay, well thank you for the very, very sweeping global vision of the issues. I want to ask some questions which in a way are inviting you to bring the argument down to the ground a little. So the first one is, when you recommend, you advise us to engage in a certain kind of thinking, in meditating, walking, dancing, and so forth, who is the we that you are speaking to or that you're hoping to do this? What people are we speaking of here? And under what conditions do you think they will be able to do this?
Now, we, as always, is a part of reality where we are, and at the same time, it is a category of aspiration. So it is in that sense, we immediately involves those of us who are interested in interrogating the contemporary limits of theorizing, and at the same time we are looking for alternatives. In terms of another dimension would be social movements, cultural movements, also spiritual movements, socio-spiritual movements, who are interested in a new imagination of society, in moving towards a new realization of society.
Do you imagine that much of this work, for instance, will be done in the university system?
Not necessarily. In fact, this is an open challenge. In fact, some of this work is being done with and beyond the universities. For example, the limits of the metropolitan post-colonial and those people who are engaged in grassroots post-colonial, for example, writing in their own mother languages and in different conditions of literature and philosophy. So this work is also coming from these kind of spaces. Just mention may be made about a person like Daya Krishna, who was located within a university setting, but his modality of work was much more open. He was initiating himself with dialogues with the classical scholars and so on and so forth. Similarly, people in literature, so it is not just confined to the university domain.
Mm-hmm. I guess the next question is really about the cast of characters you have in the paper. Given that much of the time you're thinking of broad traditions of thought, national, religious, ethical traditions as a whole, and this is the way in which you characterize Asian thought generally. How would you see that kind of analysis related to the kind of discussion that we've been having in the seminar, which has often highlighted the work of intellectuals, say, of the last 100 years or so, who've engaged with the colonial system, the decolonization process, the construction of new nations and economies, some of whom have been mentioned, people like Ambedkar, Shariati, Jose Rizal. We could sort of add people like Sun Yat-sen, Mao Zedong, important intellectual, cultural figures who have been engaged in massive transformations of Asian realities. How would you relate the kind of analysis you've been offering to the lives and contributions of people like that?
Now, all these thinkers that you have mentioned, many of them, they have been engaged with socio-political struggles, and in the process of that, they have helped us to, think about their own societies and the interlinked global societies in new ways. So, in Mao Zedong, for example, so one could find, Marxism, but also a kind of, even in his denunciation of Confucianism and so on and so forth. So one would like to explore that what was the dialogue between, say, Marxism and a kind of even a denounced Confucianism, and then to have that kind of inquiry and to come to the present, Chinese discourse, where there is a, critical theorizing, while there is a revival of Confucianism and where Confucianism has been almost made the official doctrine. So with other contemporary with the thinkers that you mentioned, for example, Ambedkar, I think Ambedkar was engaged with the modern world, and he drew inspiration from modernity. And I would like to say that sometimes his engagement with modernity was a bit uncritical, and that is understandable given his time. But at the same time, his engagement with multiple traditions, for example, his critique of caste-based tradition and struggle for justice, and his dialogue with Buddhism. Therefore, in Ambedkar, we find a way of dialogue with the emancipatory dimension of modernity, but also the need to be dialogical with the emancipatory possibilities within traditions like Buddhism.
In the paper, you take a fairly critical view of post-colonial scholarship, remarking of post-colonial scholars that many of them don't engage with social struggles in their countries of origin, that they're located socially in elite universities and English language teaching or writing, rarely entering into dialogue with the kinds of traditions that we've been talking about, and tending to take a monolithic view of Europe and Asia. I wonder if you could think for us a little more about the relationship, kind of project that you have in mind, and the kind of social science and humanities work that post-colonial scholarship has so far done, whether that kind of work in the mainstream university system has any productive role in the kind of transformations that you would like to see.
Yes. For example, Dipesh Chakrabarty's, provincializing Europe. This kind of critique and engagement is part of the struggle for transformation. At the same time, so now the challenge here is to build on the resources and possibilities from all sources as friends in the struggle for transformation, at the same time recognizing some of their structural limitation today. And when I am raising the issue of language, it is an issue that it is not so much as just to blame one or the other, but if we take it in an affirmative sense, how can we think about these societies if we do not have any way of being with these languages? Therefore, the production of social science knowledge, and it is not just limited to post-colonial theorizing. For example, social science writing in India, I think 95% of these or 90% of these would be mostly in English, though there are some social science writing in mother languages, but those writings are not finding a place in the canons of social science writing in India. Therefore, so while we acknowledge that, but how do we create conditions for moving beyond? Theoretically, therefore, as some of these post-colonial thinkers today are not just talking about Foucault, but many of them are finding new strength in the work of Gilles Deleuze and his idea of the rhizome, for example. Deleuze is saying that how we need to be consciously bilingual. So therefore, this kind of theoretical formulation, if we take it seriously, then it is not just confined to as a pronounce of statement by post-colonial thinkers, whether from India and Europe, as just a statement of enunciation. And if we take it seriously, then how do we become creatively bilingual and multilingual? And then, writing in different languages, then that also has a way of rethinking the way of thinking in the English language or the language of the dominant cosmopolitan.
Finally, what would you see as the implications of your agenda for the kind of work that most of the people here do in universities, since almost all of us are working in universities or somewhere near universities, in my case. What would this mean for the curriculum of social science teaching? And what would it mean for our pedagogy, for the way we would teach, if we're hoping to encourage new modes of learning among the students?
Thank you. Now, in terms of our role and curriculum, now the curriculum itself is not just a given thing. I think one challenge is to think, move with and beyond the curriculum. and the existing canon and the curriculum, as I think one of the lesson from our seminar is how limiting it is. But just saying that it is limiting, as some friends are already engaged with the project of bringing some of this knowledge to the curriculum, but that work is at an early stage. I think all of us we could do is to create more knowledges, more substantive knowledges, because there is a need to move from just rhetorical critique of the inadequacy of situation. So it is in this sense that we need to have much more knowledge about all these themes. For example, now if we look at state or society, self, society and state, of course some work has been already done, for example thinking about the nature of state. Now if we bring different ideas of thinking about state, society and self from multiple traditions, and in our curriculum we teach about them. So one important challenge is to, for those of us who are engaged with universities and beyond, is to be part of that process of knowledge generation. In terms of pedagogy, I think there is a limit of the fundamental limitation of existing pedagogy. For example, pedagogy is mostly involved in conditions of sitting. So in fact, the whole modern pedagogy, while modernity talks about freedom, but the pedagogy is a pedagogy of imprisonment within chair and tables. So can we think about, in a spirit of Ivan Illich, de-schooling society, or Rabindranath Tagore, when he created Vishwabharati, in fact in Tagore's university till now, so learning takes place not only within the boundaries of the four walls, it is under the trees and with the trees. So can we have a different modality of pedagogy and learning? And I think this can be creatively brought together with new developments in performance theory, both in art and as well as the theory of the performative coming from Judith Butler and others. How does our practice of learning becoming more movement, moving and movemental? And for example, reading, can we think of creating reading circles? In India we have a tradition in which social movements have created circles of reading. Similarly, in European experience, especially in Scandinavian experience, think of Stefan, 100 years ago when the workers' movement created circles of reading, which built upon traditions of the People's Folk High School movement, about which I have done some work. So if you can have these different practices of learning, not just learning in the way that as we have been produced, so that will help us to have new experience and adventures of learning as part of alternative theorizing.
Can I ask what you do in your own teaching when you're working with this kind of material with classes?
Now, my existential condition has been such that I do not get a lot of opportunity to teach, but wherever I have an opportunity, I do bring this practice of learning together. For instance, I'm just coming from a journey of mine with Indonesia, and one of my last lecture was in Gajah Mada University, and I was speaking in the Department of Agriculture about sustainable development, and in thinking about cosmologies and everything, I invited my students to think about Javanese dance. Well, some students presented, and one student suddenly came up. She said that, okay, that if you are talking about Javanese dance, would you dance with me? And so then we danced together in the class.
Very good. Glad to hear. Perhaps we should try that too.